Welcome. It's very nice to have everybody here today. We are very excited to be continuing our series in our Beethoven Off the Beaten Path project, which is this fall's offering from the Cornell Center for Historical Keyboards in honor of the 250th anniversary celebrations of Beethoven's birth. Tom Beghin is our guest today. And just to say a few words about him before we begin, Tom is, I think it's fair to say, one of the most original and creative performer scholars working in 18th and 19th century music today. His research and performances are fearless in opening our ears to new sounds and new worlds of potential meaning in the music and especially instruments of the past. Tom is senior researcher at the Orpheus Institute in Ghent, leading the research cluster Declassifying the Classics, which focuses on the intersection of historical technologies and performance. And his projects have been nothing less than groundbreaking, especially in their ambitious use of new technologies to explore old ones. And I'm thinking here of his virtual Haydn, which was a recording of Haydn's complete solo keyboard music on 7 keyboards, some of them specially constructed for the project, in the digitally reconstructed acoustics of 9 late 18th and early 19th century rooms that Haydn may have known. It was a superb presentation of the music, but it also resulted in a critically acclaimed book from Chicago University Press, and really a demonstration of this performer-scholar intersection that Tom embodies so brilliantly. More recently, his Inside the Hearing Machine took a multi-sensory, multidisciplinary approach to Beethoven's last 3 piano sonatas, exploring the question of Beethoven's deafness through a reconstruction of the hearing machine or acoustic shell, whatever it might have been, that Beethoven had made for his piano. So in numerous recordings and publications, Tom's work explores how the performer's body feels, senses, and hears at the instrument, and how he or she might have done so in the past. His most recent production continues the exploration of Beethoven, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, with his research into Beethoven's Erard piano and the creation of the Waldstein Sonata. I hope I more or less got that right. So we have with us Cornell faculty and students today ready for a lively discussion. We're going to start with Tom saying a few words about the project, and then the conversation will begin. And we're looking forward to a very lively morning. And Tom, a very, very warm welcome to you. Thank you for taking the time and beaming into us from Ghent, where I think you are today. Great, thank you.
First of all, many thanks to Mike and to Annette for this invitation to share some of my ongoing work. And of course, I'm pleased to see all of you, my old mentors, colleagues, friends. It means a lot that you've taken the time to go through the materials, namely one long documentary lecture or lecture documentary on Beethoven's French piano, and then an unusually long video performance of Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata, or should I say his Adam Sonata. These are the beginnings of outcomes from a multi-year project here at the Orpheus Institute around Beethoven's Erard Frei harpsichord-shaped piano, and more specifically, the replica that we've been privileged to make, since the making of it has been very much part of the research project, and then to play and experience it as the artistic research part of the project. There has been empirical research as well, starting with the making of the action models that you saw in the film and resulting in slow motion video capturing of how these actions behave both mechanically and acoustically. Other outcomes in the pipeline are an edited volume of keyboard perspectives, that is your own publication series, then a double CD recording and a book again for the University of Chicago Press. I'm talking to you now, but over the years, the project has involved quite a number of people. And I'd like to acknowledge them. Tilman Skowronek has been part of the team from very early on. Tilman, of course, is one of the key figures who have raised scholarly awareness of Beethoven's French piano. Organologist Eleanor Smith researched various extant Erard instruments as well as documented the building process of the replica, a task later shared with Robin Blanton, who has also continued helping me go through the Erard Livre, the Vente, the sales books and correspondence. Michael Petchak spent over a year here at Orpheus developing an expertise in advanced student, Frédéric Kalkbrenner. Robert Gilio did the slow motion experiments analyses, and there are others, Charles Schrader, Song Hee Chon, Prach Bondiskulchok, Luca Montebugnoli, Sanayet Zanari. These are mainly doctoral students. Finally, of course, there's Chris Mana, himself surrounded by a team at the Mana workshop. And here at the Orpheus Institute, we benefit from a partnership with Pianos Mana in Ruiselede. And it helps, of course, that that's a mere 20 kilometers apart from Ghent. Has Beethoven's Erard Frère been a gift or not? Somehow that question has clouded our assessment of this thing in Beethoven's life, the instrument preserved in the Linz Oberösterreichisches Landesmuseum. Our conclusion, as I expressed in the film, is that Beethoven's Erard was, at the very least, a solicited gift. And I believe that this nuance is important because it provides an element, an essential element of wanting on Beethoven's part, differently to Beethoven's other foreign piano later in his life, his 1817 Broadwood, which was a gift, but which ended up suiting Beethoven for entirely different reasons. Like the title of a 2008 volume of essays by a group of art and science historians edited by Lorraine Destin, Things That Talk. In our multidisciplinary approach, we've let the Erard piano do the talking as an object or as a piece of technology. And slowly, as we drew connections between places, mainly Vienna and Paris, between humans and their things, including musical works, we constructed what I've called in following of the work of the archaeologist Ian Hodder a tanglegram. And let me share my screen right now and show you what I mean. Here we go. What you see here is a necessarily messy network of affordances and dependencies, or what Hodder calls dependencies, interactions that are productive and enabling, and dependencies when those interactions become constraining and limiting. Hodder's theory is one of entanglement, so hence his term, tanglegram. The time frame for this tanglegram is defined on the one hand by Haydn's receiving an Erard in April 1801, or even earlier, March-April 1800, when Beethoven was cast in a duel with Daniel Steibelt, and on the other, the technical revisions made to the piano by January 1805, and the publication of his Appassionata Sonata Opus 57 in February 1807, which, taking into account this core period of 1803-1804, becomes somewhat of a delayed event. This dichotomy of positive dependence and negative dependency has been particularly useful when thinking about the technical revisions to the instrument, instigated by, or at least allowed by, Beethoven. Trying to make something that's perfectly fine even better is how I've come to conceive of the intent behind these revisions. In this case, from a pianistic composing point of view, adjusting a French piece of technology to Viennese habits. An adjustment that happened after he initially so clearly applied himself to understanding the Frenchness of his new piano. So that's the ambition versus the frustration that I keep talking about. And disentangling the two requires carefully putting side by side the timelines of, on the one hand, the genesis of the three piano sonatas that Beethoven was preparing for Breitkopf und Härtel. I'm talking here about Opus 53, 54, and 57. And on the other, the timeline of the Erard piano, specifically the timing of its revisions. Not just Opus 57 was affected, but also the publication of Opus 53. And I here refer to decisions such as cutting the original Andante, omitting the original scherzo, shortening the first movement by omitting the second repeat, which result in a coda that no longer really stands out, and finally, including a transition or introduction between the first and final movements. Now that's potentially a whole lecture in itself, and in the book I do spend a chapter on what prompted Beethoven to make those changes from the perspective of this revised instrument. What I would still like to share though, so let me go back to share screen, here we go. Oops, there we go. Is the following chart, which summarizes the piano's life history, a term borrowed from behavioral archaeology. An object's life history is defined as, quote, a sequence of activities occurring during a technology's entire existence, from the procurement of raw materials through manufacture, use and reuse, to deposition and archaeological recovery and analysis. This is a quote from Michael Schiffer. Another term would be that of behavioral chain, established to contain, quote, procurement, manufacture, use, maintenance, repair, and discard. Most conspicuous in this life history of Beethoven's era is that dramatic shift from using to revising, at its turn leading to premature discarding, with little patience in between for maintenance or repair, which is why researchers in the past have not taken Beethoven's era seriously, because Beethoven himself allegedly didn't. The impression was that he immediately wanted to change it. But as we looked closer at the evidence, and this is a detail that did not make the film, there is in fact one important trace of repair. And here's a photo from the original, well, the original revised piano, I should say, in Linz. This is Beethoven's piano. In the film, Chris Mahne talks about shifting the balance points of the keys. But here's an intermediary step that's easily overlooked in this narrative from original to revised piano. You see all these incisions in which tiny wooden shims have been inserted with the aim of tightening the gaps of those original balance points, balance holes, I should say. This is typical repair to address loose, perhaps rattling keys, reflective quite remarkably of Beethoven's intense usership. This repair indeed in all likelihood happened just a few months into his new ownership. So the necessity of such an early repair goes to the heart of what in the film I've called that vertical versus horizontal paradox, the need for the keys of a French piano to go down perpendicularly, and the desire for a Viennese pianist to still be able to cruise over that keyboard laterally. So if Opus 53 represents ambition and Opus 57 represents frustration, symbolized through that attempted solution of shifting the balance points to decrease key dip, then those incisions reflect the state of a piano that's been put back in order again to do exactly what the French piano is supposed to do. And here, intriguingly, Opus 54, as a piece sandwiched between these two grandes sonates, becomes the musical manifestation of what Ian Hodder calls fittingness, in this case, fittingness with the French piano in its best possible state. That's why in the film I chose an excerpt from the second movement of Opus 54 to demonstrate the triple registers. Tre corde, due corde, una corda, each of the hammers again neatly straight, freshly repaired with no danger of hitting any of the adjacent strings, indeed demonstrating the mechanical perfection that Sébastien Erard was so proud of. And the interesting thing here is that especially toward the end of Opus 53, we already find moments of where the issue of repair becomes increasingly urgent. The question of to glissando or not is part of this, because the more you try to do so, the more lateral friction you create on those keys, but also there must have been Beethoven's enthusiasm through the first and the final movements to use the una corda stop as a swell, constantly shifting between the softest and the loudest and putting sideways stress on individual hammer components. What's so fascinating then about mapping the piano's life history, and in the case of our new replica, reliving Beethoven's experience almost in real time over a number of years, to a timeline of Beethoven's three sonatas, which were almost certainly meant to celebrate his new ownership, is this aspect of aging. And speaking from a historically informed performance practice perspective, it becomes not just a matter of making or having at one's disposal a specific kind of instrument, but one has to also sensitize oneself to how instruments age or behave over time. And in this respect, I'd like to end with a personal experience of regret. When I recorded these pieces, I convinced Chris to re-leather the hammers of the piano. It's something we like to do, you know, to make the instrument as fresh as possible for those discerning microphones. But while this turned out to be the perfect decision for Opus 53, it was a terrible one for Opus 57, where the older and harsher hammerheads had been, and in view of the recording, would have been so much more appropriate. Malcolm Bilson and I have in the past talked about ur-instrument as a necessary counterpart to ur-texts. But what this project of reliving the experience of a foreign piano in Beethoven's life has taught me is that as it ages and changes, the instrument, just like sketches, autographs, or scores, presents us with multiple material texts in their own right, with their own inconsistencies and imperfections. So I've now added a more specific Beethoven philological angle to the project beyond what the film was able to present. So let's start a conversation.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a fantastically interesting project, and there are so many places of entry into the conversation. There are enormous numbers of details. It's extraordinarily impressive research project focused on the minute observation of detail, technological, and musical detail. But there are also a whole number of very interesting larger questions that the project raises. And I thought we might start both in kind of the specifics with this very particular piano and the larger questions it raises to do with the idea of the instrument and its affordances vis-a-vis the musical material and the tensions that might lie there. And I think that Andrew has some thoughts to start us off in that direction. Andrew.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks, Tom. First of all, I just wanted to say that I thought the documentary lecture was really, really very illuminating. I think it would be difficult to say that I didn't learn a ton from your rebuilding of the instrument and from your discussions of the Waldstein Sonata. So first of all, I really want to commend you that you captivated my attention for the entire 90 minutes. So the question that I have actually is very broad. What I wanted to ask about was sort of what the intentions were, I guess, from your end and the methods that you sort of devised when you came up with this project. So for me, it seems like this project has two main parts. One is the rebuilding of the instrument, and the other is the interpretation and maybe mapping onto of phenomenological reenactment, I guess, from the early part of the 19th century onto the 21st century. And to me, it feels like the first part of that, the recreation of the instrument, is very, very exciting. And it's there's new pieces of technology that we can learn from, and we can learn from old pieces of technology as well. In the second part of the project, I'm very curious whether it feels as if you need to have it in order to justify the first part of the project. So I'm speaking from a very practical angle. Is it possible, for example, if you're writing grants, to say, I would really like to recreate this 1803 Erard in its original condition, but I'm going to leave the sort of findings of the Waldstein Sonata as merely speculative, or perhaps that it would become sort of a tool for further research. Because I guess for me, the big question that the second part raises is really in terms of the language that you use. Because I notice that very oftentimes you'll say, I experienced this, ellipses, and then Beethoven experienced this, and then Beethoven and I experienced this. But of course, that is a mapping across time and space. And I know that this is something that in my own research, I try to be very cautious of saying that because I experienced something, that somebody else must experience that thing as well. And so I'm just curious how you decide to deal with that language, and also how, I guess, just from a practical angle, how you justified the project in the first place. To me, it requires no justification to rebuild this instrument, but I don't know whether you felt that you needed to produce findings, for example, to justify the reconstruction of this instrument in its original condition.
Well, it's interesting that that level of subjectivity that you hint at, which is sort of inherent to all artistic research projects, I suppose. I've been made, I mean, something that obviously to us it's just the way we live our professional lives, right? As performers, well, it becomes somewhat of a methodological question indeed if you tie it to the study of one particular historical object in this case. I'd like to go back to the object first. I mean, the main I'd like to start with something that I often think about when I think about Beethoven and his creative artistic life. If it's good enough for him, it ought to be good enough for me, So I think it's very important that if we are in the position to reconstruct something that at one point was a reality for Beethoven, that it makes good sense to try and reconstruct it and then see whatever we can come up and do with this. So I went into this project not knowing at all what it would lead to. So I would have been hard pressed actually, and therefore I'm very grateful that we could do it here as part of a new position at this institute where there was the willingness to take that leap of faith and say, let's do this, let's finance this, and we'll worry about the research questions later. Because I think that's what you're hinting at. I would have been hard pressed to say this is exactly why I'm trying, why I am having the instrument rebuilt. I had no idea. Similarly, I've gone actually into that project. I mean, I'm now going somewhere else, but the Beethoven, the Broadwood, and the hearing machine was similar in that respect. I had no idea. I mean, these things start with a hunch. Somehow it felt like Beethoven's Erard could be much more important than we had previously acknowledged, and it was just a matter of time before trying it out. On the question of our experience and the subjectivity in this, I think you're right. I mean, this is very much part of a methodology that I have to trust, and this is part also what I keep referring to when I talk about these experiences. I have to trust that my experiences in this case, since we're talking about what I always call a foreign piece of technology, it's a French piano that came in Beethoven's life, probably rather unexpectedly, even if he had subconsciously already wanted to go in that direction. But still, when the instrument enters his life, it's a major change. And I have to trust then that the instincts that I've built up, working mainly with Viennese instruments, are going to be sort of translatable to the things that Beethoven had gone through. And that's why, for instance, in my performance of the Waldstein Sonata, I haven't explained this very well. I haven't explained this anywhere yet. The scales, these are part of they're part of their sketch, and they have traditionally been explained as a piano exercise that Beethoven might have been preparing for some method he was intending to write. But my take on this is no, since it's recorded exactly you know, at the same time when he received the error, let's try to find a connection. And what he's trying to do there in those scales is taking a time out and practicing, figuring out how things work at a very fundamental level, and then return to the 12th time project and implement a few of those things that he found. So yes, I mean, I plead guilty in that respect, that there is constantly this double narrative here. And that's also what I hinted at with my preliminary remarks, is that the making of the instrument, taking ownership of it, I think this is actually a very important part of it, of the whole story, is I feel like I'm a co-owner. I'm somebody who's owning the same kind of thing that Beethoven once owned. And I mean, in a sense, it becomes a bit of a diary, of a logbook, so to speak, you know, all these experiences, which then of course we try to objectify then by bringing in some more empirical measurements and trying to get to the bottom of things. But I think very much, I mean, I would return that and say that that's what I mean with Beethoven during those first few weeks, let's say, or months of owning this new instrument. It was very much reacting to that object as what we would now call an artistic researcher. So I mean, and that's the experience I'm aiming to tap into. And I think if I were to objectify that and restrain from using the first pronoun and relating it to my own experiences, I think I would end up with something that is not as strong. But at the same time, I can't tell because I haven't tried. This just feels the most natural way for me to do it. But the other side of this is that since this was a collaborative work, is that in a way, I mean, this is also part of this, is that Chris Mana, as the maker, has been very intensely involved in the research questions. And it's been very revelatory to talk to him about these changes and reconstructing exactly. So I needed him to think like that Viennese technician, or like Erard, or like a builder from those days. I mean, these are similar processes, aren't they? And so that makes the team aspect of it quite powerful, I think. Anyway.
Tom, can
I hope that it begins to answer your question.
Can I just jump in there, Tom? Partly a very small side note from an organist, which is to say this just way you describe the encounter with this instrument and the fascination of the new technology and the way that one kind of experiments and plays through and really tries to, the excitement of the new encounter is one that organists who recognize, because we're always playing new instruments. I mean, everything you do is always for something that's different. It's always unfamiliar, and it's always deeply connected with the maker and the building, and that kind of experience is one that I recognize when you describe it, and I suspect that it's less familiar to the modern pianist today, who's a little
Yes.
bit where the
Yes.
technology is more uniform.
Yes. But
yeah.
No,
So
I want to say yes, exactly, and I think that very much part of the story here is that Beethoven tried to understand Erard's input. You know, all the features, all the bells and whistles of this piano. I mean, the fact that indeed all of a sudden he has to do things with these 4 pedals is quite, I mean, that's quite significant. And he would have been in Vienna, he would have been alone with these kinds of, in this new kind of thinking, this new kind of reacting to that. I mean, that's the pressure that he must have undergone with the revisions, is that when he talked to technicians and builders in Vienna, they would have had a totally different approach to this.
We're going to come back to the question of the pedals, which we're all totally fascinated by, but I'd just like to stay for a moment on that the scales and turn it over to Ji Young for a second, because I think, Ji Young, you have something to add here.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. I was wondering whether this figuration, the scales, parallel motion, and in contrary motion, whether it points to the etude as a kind of background topic for the Waldstein Sonata in the outer movements. So I'm going to come back again with some more specifics about the etude, but let me step back a bit and say that I was, this is related, I was struck by the kind of national undercurrent that permeated through much of the video, and was wondering whether you thought of your project as, in some sense, part of a broader trend to kind of de-emphasize the Germanic aspects of Viennese musical culture. So in your presentation of the Frenchness through the Erard piano and through the Louis-Adam, you focus on this idea of the son continu, and which is a completely new notion for me. I mean, it was so novel because I was so used to hearing the Waldstein outer movements as having this kind of rhythmic energy, and yet the son continu, if anything, is the opposite of that. It's no rhythm. It's about this sustained floating sound. You don't even want to hear the attacks of the notes. And yet so much of the Waldstein seems to be about rhythmic energy. And now to come back to the idea of the etude, many of which do have this kind of inexorable motoric energy, I was wondering whether by spotlighting this French pianism through the son continu, that perhaps what has been considered the English characteristics of the Waldstein have sort of receded a lot in the background, and how you envision the kind of Frenchness and the Englishness working together. And in terms of the English influence, of course, you know, people like Clementi and Dussek have been mentioned as models for Beethoven's more Anglophile pianistic writing. But I would like to add Kramer here, J.B. Kramer, and his Etudes Opus 30 to the discussion, because this was a volume that Beethoven worked with a lot. He used it to teach his nephew. It appeared at around the same time as the Waldstein was composed and when Beethoven received the Erard piano. So there were just many passages in the Waldstein Sonata that struck me as finding correlates in the Kramer volume. So can I share my screen? One moment. So beyond the, say, the first movement, you have these kind of contrary motion arpeggios, which evoke to me a kind of etude topic. I fished out a couple of, perhaps, are you able to see
Yeah.
these examples? Is it big enough?
Yes.
So for example, in the first movement, in the second theme, this idea of sustaining in the thumb or in the inner voice as melody and yet having this figuration around it, it finds its correlates in Kramer. Then, of course, the trill, the idea of having the trill in the middle and this melody poking through above is another kind of texture that finds its correlate in the Kramer. And then perhaps the more motoric one, this is also in the third movement, this figuration in the right hand with the pulsation in the left hand. Would you agree with me that that there is a kind of etude, concern with the etude in Beethoven's mind as he's working on the Waldstein, and of which the sketches of the scales in parallel and contrary motion that you showed us would seem to support or corroborate?
Well, it's very, your examples are very interesting. I think that, I mean, the etude in the sense of studying something, yes, but I'd like to just quickly demonstrate because I'm set up here with the two pianos. Okay. So the point of these scales, I think you can still hear me if I sit here, huh? Mm-hmm. I mean, on this piano, we are used to these kind of fingerings, or this is actually an example from Louis-Adam, but yada, we always give shades to what we do, right? I mean, we group things in 3 notes or in 4 notes. And that's exactly by this kind of example, this kind of it's very hard to keep shaping these things in any regular way because you're doing this with the 2 hands at the same time and you're using your thumb at places that are not, that don't feel so familiar on the kind of things we'll be doing on a Viennese piano. And as I was practicing this over and over, you know, getting used to these fingerings, after a while of your focus, and that's the paradox, instead of following these letter shapes, your focus starts shifting to you know, you start hearing these tens. This is also the way he ends. And then we have, I mean, that's the way I played it. But the idea of the 10th is a very, very sonoric one in French, from a French perspective. I mean, you can actually follow a thread of parallel 10ths through the first movement if you wanted to. Etc. I mean, the idea of the 10th is very, very strongly present in the Waldstein Sonata, the first movement. So I would say an etude, yes, but the paradox here is that something that is so technical and so mundane pianistically as a scale takes on a very much higher aesthetic meaning. And it's its way into discovering what the piano, the French piano, can do from a sound point of view. And then we're back to the son continu. You know, that's and then we're back to the tremolo. And the interesting thing here about what you brought up about the Waldstein being very rhythmic, that's of course the way we've always been looking at it from a perspective of Viennese pianos. And it's true that when Beethoven does introduce his tremolo, he's not doing it the French way. The French way would be to have the lower note first, to exactly counter that expectation of rhythmic clarity and go more for the sustained sound. So Beethoven is putting the E, the third, on top, which gives that edge of rhythmic clarity, Viennese clarity, to a French idea. So it's very much indeed a fusion, but at least I sense that there is a studying on Beethoven's part to understand the sonoric possibilities of this instrument. As far as the English side of things, well, yes, I mean, but that's, I mean, that it's the same as saying that because Clementi was adored in France, you know, Clementi was also considered the father of modern pianism by people like Louis Adam and Steibel. So it's kind of arguing the same thing in a way. We could do this whole project with English examples.
But the hybridity, like French-English hybridity, is sort of built into the hardware, right? And I mean, I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that these early Erard pianos overlap very much with the Broadwood pianos of around 1800.
Absolutely. And Erard went to England during the revolutionary years and picked up a lot of ideas there. But then at the same time, there is an effort on his part to make his pianos also distinctly French. But you're absolutely right. If we are to say compare A and B, we would select the English pianos and then see how Erard has tried to perfect those. I mean, that's his model. His model is not the Viennese pianos.
Tom, if I may just kind of jump in and follow up on sort of your demonstration just now. You're sort of comparing the kinds of difference in resonance between your Walter on the left and the Erard, and how that inspires you to group or think about even these scales, bare bone scales, differently. In your lecture, you put a lot, and also in your slide earlier on just now, I noticed you put a lot of emphasis on, of course, the action being heavier and deeper, and you know, compared with the Viennese counterpart. I'm curious why you've not conceived of the other kind of corollary difference, which is of course, you know, the greater resonance and sustain in the sound as counteracting that. So, you know, you put a lot of emphasis on the verticalness of this French piano, but the fact that it resonates a lot more gives it very much a horizontal dimension that with the Viennese piano, despite it being more shallower, hands gliding along more easily, but one also has to work much harder to sustain chords, for instance, on Viennese piano. So, I mean, as pianists, we all know that these dimensions are never independent of one another. I'm curious whether that at least these two dimensions on the Erard, how they work together in your mind, whether they balance each other out in some other interesting way, and it's not so sort of clear that the Erard is more of a vertical aesthetic versus the Viennese, which is the horizontal aesthetic.
Well, can you help me out? What are your thoughts?
Well, for instance, something specific, maybe, you know, the second theme of the Waldstein, I mean, let's say these chords, you of course played them all rolled, and I know some of us want to ask you about that as well. I mean, rolling them is one way to give them a horizontal dimension. But I wonder, you know, what's your thinking behind that? On the Viennese piano, because it decays faster, it has less sustain, those chords, one would have to work harder for them to really sustain at a certain tempo, whereas I could imagine on the Erard or on our 1799 Broadwood, which is in many ways comparable, the greater resonance itself helps those chords move from one to the next. Over legato slur. I'm just curious why these two dimensions were not talked about together in your lecture. I'm interested from your experience.
Well, I mean, it's still confusing in my mind. I mean, we're thinking about the second theme of the Waldstein on a Viennese piano. You'd have to really try and convey the idea of sustaining sounds by shaping the slur and play the whole thing tapering off. It's a totally different way.
I mean, is Beethoven, for instance, already on the second page, a minute or so into the piece, getting frustrated in the ways you're framing by sort of injecting some kind of element of difficulty with the chords on this deep action? I'm trying to go along with your framing and imagine what your notion of the second theme is, for instance.
And of course, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bring out what I perceive as a very much a harp topis here. I mean, the fact that these chords are very, very close to one another. It's like you would find them easily. I mean, it's the same kind of texture as what you would have going on a harp. Let me bring up another example. There's something really extraordinary about this long slur and the harmonies that Beethoven uses. This one is a dissonance. I mean, on this piano, because those transitional tones, those dissonances, the B flat here and then the G here, they don't sustain that well. And I see this example as a fundamental reverse in aesthetics. I mean, here you almost want to do ridiculous because you can't have that tapering off on a dissonance. It should be the other way around, right? I mean, dissonance, consonance. That's the Viennese style, and this is turned upside down here by one big slur, which is one of the reasons I think that Beethoven, I mean, we have that anecdote of him playing the piece for his friends, and the suggestion was made to omit the Andante Favori. That the timeline suggests that when Beethoven would have played this piece, we don't know which piano he would have used. But if he had used his own Erard piano, the Erard piano would have been revised. It would no longer have, because I do believe that, I mean, this is starting to answer your question actually now. I do believe that the action itself has far-reaching consequences on the acoustics. I mean, if you have a lower key, you're never gonna create the same kind of ringing sounds. So Beethoven, when he would have been playing this, I mean, this is hypothetical, when he would have been playing the Andante on the revised Erard, it would no longer have sounded the way it did when he was conceiving of the piece, which might have been a very strong reason to just eliminate it in that sonata.
Thank you.
So
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, this is of course essentializing a lot, but I do think that the Erard as the first, you know, English type, French type piano coming in Beethoven's life did have a very far-going effect that he then temporarily stepped away from as soon as the piano was no longer so prominently in his life. And
Thank you. I think I will pass the baton to somebody else, but I think we're getting at the heart of a lot of issues that we've been thinking about. And that is, to what extent does a passage, especially in the music of Beethoven, you know, play with or against the instrument? And very often this could be two sides of one coin. And as you just demonstrated, so much of Beethoven's expressive power is the sense that he's playing against the instrument. And of course, other times when it's going with the affordances of the instrument, that it gets at some other expression as well. And I know my colleagues have questions also, for instance, about earlier keyboard works by Beethoven that already have some of these features. For instance, a long legato slur over chords, for instance, you know, Opus 10, F major already, and other kinds of tremolo type textures. So I'll pass the baton on to someone else.
On the topic of the tremolo, perhaps, I mean, there's a tremolo and there's a tremolo. What I've tried to establish is, what I've tried to demonstrate in the lecture is that there is an idiomatic French tremolo, and the one I would venture to say, I am gonna go on a limb here, but that the one in the Waldstein sonata is the first one that resembles the French tremolo idea the closest. I mean, if you think of something like, I have to where's my pedal? So here. That's not a French tremolo. I mean, it's not, the tremolo is not the dominating idea. French tremolo would be something like this, the whole thing, like we have in the Ghost Trio, but that's also later. And the Waldstein is the first of these types of examples. I mean, I do believe that the tremolo was a new interest of study at Beethoven around this time.
Tom, it's Zach. At some point in the film, you say, like Beethoven, I can't get enough of it, right before you sit down and perform. And you're like, as we all are when we approach these instruments, you know, a kid in a candy shop. So is the tremolo you're talking about bar 14 when he comes back to the theme as an octave higher with the bass and the octave? Right, right. So my question is, with all these pedals, you're experimenting a lot. I couldn't quite see how you dealt with the opening, but I think you used the unicorda.
Yes, I do.
Okay. Um, I love that this instrument you can hear kind of harmonic motion as a kind of. But coming back to Ji Young's comment, while it's delightful not to hear it as kind of frustrated Stravinsky motorrhythmic opening, um, it almost struck me as dreamy. And I didn't know if is that what you're after? In other words, it seems to me in bar 14, it's dreamy because you have the octave and the bass and you float above it with this tremolo. But certainly, compared to the Walter, this low mid-range must have been a murky new mess for his oral world. So why not work against the instrument and play it with rhythmic energy, and already it's going to have a kind of continuous sound. In other words, when do you choose as a performer to go with and against the instrument? It's coming back to these questions.
It's a very good question, Zach. You're right. I mean, then you would be. I mean, okay. It was indeed a conscious decision. I mean, it's not really a conscious decision. It just happens that I was intent to find these moments of discovery on Beethoven's part, discovery of things that are recognizable in French repertoire of this time, and linking it, say, to his experience, you know, dueling against somebody like Steibelt, and he might have been intrigued, you know, by all the tricks, the foot tricks that Steibelt was known to be able to perform, etc. So yes, that's the way I have looked at this, and I've deliberately wanted to show a French side of the Waldstein Sonata. But at the same time, you're right. I mean, the fact that he already there in that tremolo decides to shift the good and the bad notes and give it more rhythmic clarity might point you to a different direction and say, I'm going to deliberately show a quote-unquote Viennese version of this French effect. And definitely I could have, I mean, that would have been a decision. But I suppose, and this goes actually back to the first question of Andrew about the subjectivity. Here I was aligning myself with the more empirical research that was going on around me, keen to present the affordances, the French affordances of these instruments also in my interpretation. And there is, of course, a danger that I've gone too far and that it's not, you know, reflective of what Beethoven's intents actually were. But it's interesting that you bring it up because I feel like, hey, yeah, maybe you're right. But I would still like to, I should not say one would still like that one understands the origin of these things, right? Yeah. I mean, if I just play it's indeed closer to what we have over here. I mean, this is very, this is already a mellower version of what's going on over there. But I'm going to the extreme because I'm really intent on showing the tremolo origin of all of this. And I'm intent on showing the sonic properties of all of this when I talk about the overtones and I made that connection with the last movement.
Right.
That's very important in my interpretation.
That last movement works so beautifully on that instrument. And I wondered, did you add the Celeste stop in bar 14 for that tremolo? Like, how did you deal with your choice of pedals? Because sometimes we see your feet like clamping down all four at once, and
yeah, I mean, the only one going on record saying that this is something that can be done is Steibelt. Steibelt says, he talks about the harp pedal, which is this one, and then the fact that it has to be always combined with a damper pedal, and you have to play it with one foot.
I see.
So yeah, I mean, I'm exploring, I'm discovering, I'm trying. I mean, I can't. I mean, the idea here, the premise here is, and whether it's fantastical or not. I mean, that's for me. That's beside the point. But when you receive this fantastic new, perfect, beautiful new piano, and you have these four pedals that you've never seen, the Waldstein is the first piece that Beethoven wrote. We know that. So why wouldn't he have started exploring these various effects? I mean, I'm not a really very strong believer in thinking that all of Beethoven's pedal indications will become clear through reading the score. That's part of what I was suggesting in my opening remarks, is that we have to start seeing these instruments as part of the material of texts that we're dealing with, and look at the possibilities there. So I don't see that restrictive, the score. I see the instrument as enabling. Yeah, I mean, but it's done in the spirit of discovery of something new. Absolutely.
Right. Miri has a question. Yeah.
Hi, I really enjoyed your lecture and your performance very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask two questions. One is about the glissandos in the end of the third movement. My second question is related to that. It's the second theme of the first movement. So in both cases, I noticed that you slowed down quite a bit in a way that is not, as far as I know, indicated in the music in any edition, or I might be wrong, but that's what I thought. What made you slow down in the second theme of the first movement, and why do you actually roll the chords? I'm sorry if the answer is obvious, but I wanted to hear it from you. And about the glissando, I played this piece many times only on a modern piano, as well as the first piano concerto, and the glissandos on the white keys is nearly impossible for me. But I think it might have been possible, actually, if I could have done it much slower. So I just wonder, is the choice of a slower tempo in the third movement of the Waldstein just because it's impossible otherwise? Or, I'm sorry, maybe you talked about it in your lecture and I just don't remember.
No, I mean, actually, Malcolm Wilson wrote his doctoral dissertation on the fantasy elements in sonatas. And I think that would be my short answer, is that this comes at a very cadenza-like moment of the piece, where, it's actually part of the convention to not, not adhere to strict tempo. But that's a bit of a cop-out answer, I suppose. I just don't think it's very, very easy here. And that's of course what we've always been saying, is that if we play this on a historical instrument, it becomes much easier on a modern piano. But in the comparison of the Viennese piano and the French, I mean, it's not true at all. So I made this point that, and it's the attempting to do so that's very much part of the story. What I try to explain is that, I mean, normally the way to play these consecutive octaves, as Louis Adam describes, is by stiffening your forearm. You have to have a necessary element of stiffening, otherwise it doesn't work. But if you do that, then it's going to sound, of course, much too loud on the Erard piano. And I mean, if I made the point that I can exploit the technology of those pedals, but you're reducing the sound and still be able to do this stiffening of my forearm and get away with it. Now, it sounds like I haven't quite convinced you, because it's probably somebody else could do this much faster than I can. But that's part of, I think that's part of the rhetoric in this music, is that Beethoven, and that's what I mean with Beethoven acting as an artistic researcher, meaning that he's puzzled by this himself, and he's asking questions about this. The fact also, I mean, this is something that I relate to from the experience of playing the piece quite a number of times, is that it's something that you cannot do blindly, you know. I mean, you cannot do it, you cannot do it, I didn't mean blindly, you can't do it as the first thing that you do. The fact that it happens at the end of a piece, you know, you've had quite a lot of time to warm up and to gain confidence. And sometimes I'm actually quite surprised at how well I can do it. It doesn't happen every time, but when it does, it's really great. And I think that's part of the rhetoric of what Beethoven is trying to capture. I mean, it's his personal experience.
Thank you. And what about the second movement? Second theme of the first movement? I also noticed that it was quite a bit slower suddenly. I understand that, of course, the character and the atmosphere, the colors are very different. But the slower tempo with all the rolled chords, it sounds really beautiful. I just wanted to hear what you think about it.
I mean, I've explained this concept of thinking of these sections of we have something happens, we have something 1/10 higher, and then we have another one of these sections over here. And I'm really letting myself be guided by whenever I feel it's right to continue, you know. When I feel ready to continue from an acoustic point of view. So that's I guess that's another aspect where I've overemphasized, or I've emphasized, the French sonoric quality of these things. So let the sound and the development of these sounds determine the timing.
Thank you. Well, it's very beautiful. I've never heard it played like this before. So.
I mean, the other thing that's really striking in this passage is. Here is B. Which is a note where Beethoven writes forzando. And the extraordinary thing is, and I haven't, I mean, this could be a little research project in itself, but I haven't figured out why. I don't know where this is, it just so happens that this B sticks out. There must be some reason, acoustical reason, having to do with overtones and stuff. But these kinds of moments make you relate with the effect that Beethoven might be creating, and then you gain confidence in the approach of leaving the pedal throughout, having these harmonies be mixed, a la Steibelt. So I mean, this is exactly as Steibelt would do, and as he does in his Grand Sonata Opus 64. And so this is one of those aha moments, you know, where you think, yeah, it worked for Beethoven. It seems I get the same kind of pleasure out of this moment. So,
can you give just one other example where in other pieces of Beethoven that you do that? I'm very curious.
You mean
roll all those chords?
Well, we have Mike and Malcolm here, and the famous example is,
yes,
you know, opening of the fourth.
Yes. Other than that.
Other than that, well, but it's actually quite relevant, because there's of course a big Orpheus theme there. So we're back to the lyre, which is exactly what I'm trying to get out of this instrument too. And then even that visual association of those four rods, you know, brings up the image of the lyre. Other examples, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, next week I have to play Opus 110 again with the hearing machine, and I love this example where you have the fact that he has a dotted quarter note. I mean, normally you would just play it like this, but if you imagine that huge hearing machine in front of you, you need to have the time to lean your head into it, to listen, and then continue when your ears tell you that it's the right time to do so. I mean, I like these moments. These are the moments of reality that I keep talking about, you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
This question of the Orphic sort of topic coming in here, I was just really curious, insofar as you described it earlier, the second subject as being harp-like, which indicates a kind of solitary utterance, right? Or it just seems to kind of cut against the received wisdom that this is a chorale topic for the second theme, and then that seems also to kind of reciprocate with Czerny's observation about the first theme being sort of chorale-like, which I found really surprising, and I just wondered if you could speak a little to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I loved. I mean, it's really you're raising new associations for me too now. That contrast between something that's chorale-like and then you have that those improvisatory harp-like moments. What I think is happening here, I love the fact that we're going from E major to C sharp minor, and which raises the the C sharp minor topos of, as one of our doctoral students here, Sanae, works on the topos of hypnosis. It's something that it's entranced. And the fact that this is happening on, I mean, this is really known in the analytical literature. You can throw it back to that, of course. But you must have something else in mind when you bring up the chorale. And I mean, it is true that these moments of the E major second theme and then again the A major becoming A minor, the second theme in the recapitulation, they are different in that respect. They are a counterpoint to the chorale and the song continue idea. Absolutely. What's also amazing about that second theme, the A major, A minor version, is the fusion of A major, A minor fusing into C major. And that's going back then to that scale idea that I proposed at the beginning. It all has to work within that C major son continu idea, which then in the last movement becomes, I mean, it scales all over. But they're not just scales. They are C major, fundamental C major sounds, son continu. That's the paradox. And that's the paradox of the vertical and the horizontal. You create these long sounds by little vertical strokes. But that's, I mean, we're expressing an idea that's actually fundamental to the instrument of the piano, of course. But to see that so prominently present here, crystallized by the comparison of these two pianos, I find quite fascinating.
Andrew, you had your hand up. Would you like to, do you have a comment you want to add?
It's just very quick. I wanted to ask, you said that the Waldstein is the first example of this exploration of the French tremolo, but I wanted to ask, unless I'm mistaken, what would you make, there's a passage of this sort of tremolo found in the third movement of Opus 26 as well. And I'm curious whether you think of that as similar, different? With the pedal down and everything, right?
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up because I actually also noted that. And the way I've dealt with this is that, I mean, this is a piece that he might have written in direct response to his duel with Steibelt. The timing fits. But I mean, the association that I get there is a different kind of tremolo. It's much more a militaristic type of tremolo. Ta-dam. You could perfectly well imagine. I mean, Steibelt's wife joining in, ta-dam, with her tambourine or something. I think it's a different kind of. It's not a son continu type of tremolo. It's it's the more rhythmic kind. But look, I mean, I haven't made a study of tremolo. It would be a great study for somebody to look to all of the examples, tremolo-like examples in Beethoven, and try to come up with some kind of a classification. But I mean, that piece was written after he had heard Steibelt, And I'm now drawing a blank. I don't know whether you would have known Haydn's Erard already, but the subject here. Another reason why it's a complex study is that wanting aspect must have been planted by the time he got to know Haydn's Erard, and over time thinking, I want an instrument just like that. So we're dealing with this whole group of pieces, starting with Opus 26, but then also especially Opus 30 and the Tempest Sonata, where there's so many of these French textures already. Although, if you were to play it here, you would immediately realize it doesn't quite work. I mean, it doesn't quite work on the Viennese piano, but it doesn't quite work yet on the French yet. But there seems to be an element of him looking forward, anticipating getting one himself one day, without yet knowing at that point. So yeah, I mean, it's never simple.
Richard, you have your hand up. You want to ask a quick question?
Just to echo all my colleagues, thank you so much for this, Tom, and kind of living in your idea world, especially having spent some time with the hearing machine work that you've done and now experiencing this. I'm really intrigued by your balancing of the scales, as it were, of the text, the body, and then specifically, the ear. Not to dissociate that but from the body, but the phenomenological sight of hearing. And for the performer, sometimes interacting with this repertoire, we overprivilege or perhaps sequence them in a way, and I really love the kind of ecological design you've brought to it, which often yields these questions that so many people have brought up where maybe they don't even have answers. But to kind of touch on and build on some of the questions and comments from you and from the colleagues, I'm intrigued by the fact that for a lot of these examples, you're pointing to the idiosyncrasies of certain musicians, or perhaps the qualities that they brought to the cultural networks that were most notable and unusual, specifically Steivelt's pedaling, and then, perhaps more speculatively, Kalkbrenner's associations with Adam and what Adam brought to that, and, the list goes on. Jung mentioned Dussek. But then when discussing what we might imagine Beethoven's intentions would be in engaging with these various instruments, and then the way that those intentions are reflected in the notation or not, you draw on, and rightly so, you draw on what might be, I guess, called like habituated thinking, or this I guess taps into this nationalistic aspect, the idea of Beethoven as a Viennese pianist, kind of generally speaking. And of course, as we know, he had his own idiosyncrasies, quite a lot of them. So I'm kind of curious, I guess this gets back to a couple of questions, which were, when do we allow either Beethoven or his networks individual voices to kind of shine through as part of this, I guess we could call it, trialectic of text, body, and hearing? And when do we kind of allow those to recede to allow a more generalized idea of national schools to guide the thinking? Or is it just, again, its own dialectic in your mind?
I guess it's what I wanted to provoke with the tanglegram that I presented at the beginning, is by putting the instrument and Beethoven at the center of this whole tanglegram. I mean, these are the kinds of questions that you are suggesting. I mean, and the whole idea of appropriation and adjustment, and then the revisions and the Viennicization. I mean, it goes back to Zach's question about how far do you decide to go, at what point, and when I answered, well, first I want to discover Frenchness, and then I want to understand how Beethoven reacts to it. I mean, it's very tricky, and we're constantly rowing against inconsistencies. I mean, we brought up Steibelt, for example, as an example of French pianism, but we don't even know what kind of piano Steibelt would have played in Vienna. And that seems pretty crucial to make that oral connection, at least, things that Beethoven might have picked up, you know, from hearing Steibelt play. It would have been great for our purpose if he had indeed been playing on a French piano, or at least an English piano, but we don't know that for sure. So that's where you can only go that far with these kinds of national stereotypes. Yet, of course, I mean, there's as you say, the body, the ear, the human ear of Steibelt represented. So even if you were playing on a different piece of a different kind of instrument, there would still be a recognizable style, French, for lack of a better word, style in his playing. I mean, I think you're touching on quite a few of the aspects that have been discussed already. Is how Beethoven then absorbs all of that and in his own idiomatic way.
Well, I guess I was particularly struck by something that came up early on in the documentary, that you were pointing to the 5-finger scale in the opening of Waldstein, and how, I mean, it's very much tied into what's been discussed at length already, but the horizontal movement on the Viennese piano versus the more vertical digital movement required of the RR. And I guess I was just struck by how you were pointing to the notation of that and what it was requiring, and how the intentions behind that might have been directly linked to Beethoven's kind of habituation within the Vienna culture and the Vienna, like just that whole milieu. So that's kind of where that question was coming from, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With Beethoven, so many of these things just happen on a private level. I mean, they're difficult to disentangle because, you know, he's Beethoven. I'm thinking now, if you compare all of this, say to Haydn, who is known to go to England and then changes his style, right there, I mean, it's so much more transparent to analyze these changes and these, but it's a little bit of a similar story. I mean, I'm reminded of that Haydn sonata, which is so clearly a response to English reality. And I see something similar at the opening of the Waldstein, where, I mean, the sheer exhilaration of playing. It's something where I would almost feel like you could all come here and try it out for yourselves. But to do this on this type of action, it's such a pleasant thing, and you can keep doing it forever. And then to see Beethoven exploit exactly this idea for so long in that sonata must mean something. And then the contrast with on the Viennese piano, it starts quite a bit. You don't need that appoggiatura to get the sharpness that Beethoven seems to be wanting to remind himself of, or to be puzzled about in the French piano. Anyway, they're complex issues, and I find that the more we can start thinking about these in very concrete terms, you know, how things feel mechanically, how things sound acoustically, and things that things that we can measure and quantify. I mean, the more exciting it gets, and the more new possibilities it generates for research and for interpretation.
There is so much that we could talk about here, Tom, and I'm aware of the fact that we're already a little bit over time. That's the problem when you do such interesting work. It's so inspiring and so exciting. I would like to just have the possibility to have a quick question from Jim, who had some thoughts on your reconstruction of the Waldstein. I don't know if it's possible to do that quickly. And then I thought we might just ask Malcolm to say just a little word and bring us to a close.
the question is really a substantial change of topic, my question. And so I'll simply pose it. But if it were thought unproductive to try to address it here and now, that would be okay. But the question is for Tom. The so-called work that you performed in the video is no work that has ever existed before. Not only, there are several levels. One, the little bit of music you played after the first movement is a bagatelle. And although it was written down at a time contemporaneous with with Opus 53, and I believe and I thank Ji Young for supplementing what I've been able to figure out on in conjunction with the writing down of the so-called Introduzione. There's no reason to suppose it has anything to do with, that it was ever intended to have anything to do with the work we know as Opus 53. Then, of course, you play the Andante Favori, which Beethoven decided not to disseminate as part of the sonata. And then, having done that, you have a go at the Introduzione, but you make a massive cut in it. And admittedly, the cut is smooth. Measure 5 equals measure 20 in a way. So the result is a kind of hodgepodge or concoction. And I don't understand quite what the point is of, as it were, publicly disseminating this concatenation of movements and fragments and cut into movements and so on, as if it were a work.
This is not my idea, but this is Barry Cooper who has suggested that. I mean, I had a conversation with him about this. I mean, it is true. I mean, the scherzo plays around many of the ideas that are already present in the first movement. It's also built on a descending scale. You have that G sharp A, which is very prominently present in the first movement as well. So it does seem to continue certain lingering creative ideas that Beethoven wants to finish. Whether it belongs whether it then belongs in the quote unquote work or not, that's a different question.
I am going to just jump in here because I think this is a conversation that needs longer and deserves longer, and there'll be other chances to continue this. Malcolm, I'm going to get to you. I just saw David's hand up, and so because you're here on our screen, David, one quick question, and then we'll go to you, Malcolm, and close, if that's all right.
Yes, a very modestly proportioned question. The reconstruction is fascinating. The piano is absolutely beautiful. What you do with it is amazing. Totally compelling stuff. Sumptuous production. Brilliant work. Thank you for all that. But there tends to be, as one used to say in the humanities, a slippage between the reconstruction, the replica, what you call, and the original. It's a monet, right? It's not an errard. And that's always the way it is. And when you go to reconstructions too, often you hear the reconstructor as much as you hear the original. So, but I'm just wondering if you could say a few words about the experience of playing the real one, admittedly much more aged than the new one, which was aging probably more rapidly even than I, about what that experience is.
Well, but the real one, of course, isn't the original one. That's why this whole thing is so damn complicated. I mean, in a sense, I would have I mean, the one thing that that in hindsight we were originally planning to make a replica of the revised action as well, but then at some point Chris decided no, it's gonna be too problematic, for the same reasons why Beethoven abandoned the piano at some point. So, but going back to it and then actually playing on it, it is actually more flexible than I thought it would be. I mean, the problem is it's unrestored, the instrument. So it can give you some idea of how the revised action feels. What happened in this particular project is that we had to combine Beethoven instruments with other models of unrevised instruments, obviously. So it's actually, I mean, to be honest, the instrument is just as much a copy, say, of the 1805 era that's in Brussels right now than as this of Beethoven's instrument. So, I mean, right there, we're dealing with a problem. So, I mean, I honestly, even if I could answer the question of how does it feel to play on Beethoven's, on the original in Erard, it would not be of relevance vis-a-vis the restored original action that we have.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that the old are completely authentic in whatever sense that might mean, but just to, I guess, to foreground the notion that in fact you're not playing an Erard. You know, sometimes you play these graph copies. I mean, I'm not a pianist, but they don't really feel like graph pianos. You know, graph pianos. You certainly get that in the organ too, where this problem is much more intractable, as it were.
I see that. Yeah. On the other hand, it's the best we can do.
Yeah, no, and I completely laud the project and what you've done with it. And the piano, I mean, just the way it glows on screen is incredibly seductive.
Because I mean, for me, the aspect of novelty is very important. So even if we can't reach that point where we can confidently say, okay, this is a good copy of the original, the element of novelty is very important to me. I mean, I want these things to be as optimally possibly functioning as possible. I mean, as optimally functioning as possible.
Yes, and Malcolm, over to you, I think.
Well, am I on?
Yeah.
Am I talking? Yeah. It is an Erard. Of course it's an Erard. Because that's a type of piano. And the original graphs and the graph copies by different builders, of course they're different in some subtle way, but they do operate as graph pianos operate. It's not quite the same, I think, as organs, which are much more individual instruments, you know, built. But I just want to say that, Tom, you are really terrific. You know what I mean? Because you are fearless and adventurous, and you don't just do stupid stuff, but you always really seem to go after things. And of course it's going to be not Beethoven, it's going to be you, but it's very, very admirable. And congratulations, that's all I can say.
I so agree. Thank you, Malcolm. I mean, what's beautiful about this is that the conversation will continue. And Tom, I don't know, it's just so exciting. So thank you for sharing this with us and for giving us a preview. And we will look forward to much, much more. And thank you all today for taking the time and making the effort as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.